Last year, 3 different people crossed the 6-figure net worth mark in the exact same month. Same milestone, same triumphant screenshot of the same tiny green line ticking upward. You've probably taken that screenshot yourself, or you're about to. But what happens in the months after that moment has almost nothing to do with how sharp any of these 3 people are. Carla's $100,000 was 78% locked inside the walls of her house. Farid had his spread across 3 index funds so unexciting they could double as a sedative. Dalton sat in a brokerage account, in cash, waiting for him to make up his mind. 30 years later, one of them is $986,000 behind the person who did the least work of all 3. And here's the part that should really bother you: the reason isn't a choice he consciously made. It's a choice that was handed to him in week 6, unrequested, terms already filled out. That same option never once showed up for the other 2. I'm Yank, and I've spent an unreasonable chunk of my life digging through Federal Reserve spreadsheets so you don't have to. If you've ever hit a savings milestone and felt, for about 4 days, like you'd finally cracked the code on money, subscribe, because today we're tracing exactly what happens after your first $100,000, in the order it actually unfolds. Let's start with the uncomfortable part. Your $100,000 is not what your brain believes it is. Per the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, $100,000 puts you at roughly the 38th percentile nationally. 38th. You're not in the club, you're not even in the parking lot of the club. Statistically, you're sitting slightly below the middle of the pack while holding a number that feels massive. Be careful here, because this is exactly where most finance channels mislead you with averages. You'll hear that the average American household net worth is about $1,063,000. The median is $192,900. Same country, both numbers, the average is more than 5 times the median because a small group of people who own hospitals drag the number into orbit. When someone quotes you an average net worth, they aren't informing you. They're performing a magic trick. But your milestone is genuinely meaningful in one specific way. At $100,000 invested and earning roughly 7% after inflation, your money throws off about $7,000 a year without you lifting a finger. That's the first point in your life where your portfolio contributes something on the same scale as your own hard work. Your snowball is finally rolling, which is exactly why this is the worst possible moment to take your hands off it. So in week 1, the only question that actually matters is this: where is your money sitting? It sounds like bookkeeping, but it's actually the decision that shapes everything that follows, because where your money sits determines who can see it, who can market to you, and whether you can access it when your car breaks down. Carla's answer, Farid's answer, and Dalton's answer sent all 3 of them down completely different paths, and not one of them realized it at the time. Carla did the single most respectable thing an American can do: she bought a house. Her net worth statement reads $114,000, and it feels incredible. It's also, quite literally, a wall. Fed data shows the median household holds around 68% of its total wealth in its primary residence. So if your $100,000 looks like the typical Americans, you don't own a portfolio, you own drywall. And drywall has some fascinating properties as an asset: you can't sell it in pieces, you're not diversified, one asset, one city, usually the same employer who signs your paycheck. You pay roughly 1% of its value every year just to keep it from falling apart. That's about $4,000 a year that never makes it onto the screenshot. And pulling your money back out costs 8 to 10%, which makes your house the most expensive ATM on the planet. Here's week 3 for Carla, and I want you to really sit with it. It's a Tuesday. The transmission gives out on the interstate. She's parked on the shoulder, hazards flashing, on hold with a tow company. While the hold music plays, she opens her banking app, $40 in checking. Then she flips to the other tab, her net worth tracker, $114,000. She's looking at both numbers at the same moment. Then she puts $2,200 on a credit card at 19% interest and drives the loaner home, technically wealthier than 60% of the country. That's not a Carla problem. And if you just ran that same math on yourself and didn't love the answer, you're in good company. Bankrate's 2026 survey found only about 47% of Americans could cover a surprise $1,000 expense. An earlier survey framed it the opposite way, 59% couldn't cover it without going into debt. I'll give you both numbers instead of just the scarier one. Here's what nobody tells you about crossing this threshold: net worth is a scoreboard, not a bank account. You can't hand a mechanic a slice of home equity, and in my experience, tow truck drivers have never once asked to see your Zillow estimate. Carla stays stuck on this road for 8 years, her wealth completely real and completely out of reach. Now, week 6. Dalton's brokerage balance ticks past 6 figures on a Tuesday afternoon. Thursday morning, his phone rings, local number. The guy on the line is warm, unhurried, genuinely likable. He mentions he works with a lot of folks at Dalton's company. He's not pitching anything, he just asks whether anyone's ever built Dalton an actual financial plan, in a tone that makes it obvious the answer is no, and offers to grab coffee. There's a small conference room with a whiteboard. There's a folder with Dalton's name spelled correctly on the front. Farid crossed that same threshold the very same week. His phone never rang, not that month, not that year. And it wasn't just the phone. That same fortnight, 2 other things landed in his mailbox: a pre-approved auto financing offer with the rate already quoted, no application required, and a cash-out refinance mailer, because Redfin found the typical mortgaged homeowner is sitting on roughly $180,000 in untapped equity, and somebody would love to help untap it. Nobody sent Dalton any of that when his balance was $4,000. All 3 offers landed within 6 weeks of one number crossing one line, because $100,000 to $250,000 in assets is exactly where you clear most advisors' account minimums, and where your credit profile tips into a tier that generates offers automatically. You didn't apply for any of it, you simply became eligible, and eligibility gets sold. Hold on to that fortnight detail, because nothing bad actually happens in it. It's just coffee and 2 envelopes. But nearly everything Farid loses over the next 30 years traces back to it, and mostly not through the advisor, which is the part people expect. Mostly through the envelope. Specifically, the truck. Something happens to you psychologically when you cross this number, and it isn't a character flaw, it's a reflex. Some part of your brain files the milestone as graduation. You drove the beater. You skipped the trip. And now the number says you made it, so your brain reasonably concludes you can stop being weird about money. But notice the timing, because this is the part one had wrong for years: that reflex doesn't fire on its own. It fires when something gives it permission. And that permission showed up in the mailbox in week 6, pre-approved, rate already filled in. Dalton didn't wake up one day and decide to shop for a truck. He'd been carrying a piece of paper in his kitchen drawer for 7 weeks that said yes before he'd even asked. Boston Fed research found that the marginal propensity to consume, meaning the share of an extra dollar you spend instead of save, is roughly 10 times higher for low-wealth households than for high-wealth ones. So Dalton now has the balance sheet of a saver and the spending reflexes of someone who's never had money. Those two are about to collide, and only one of them has access to financing. The average new car now runs about $49,353, up more than 30% since 2020. The average monthly payment on a financed car is $772. And here's where it stops being funny: 29.3% of trade-ins last quarter were underwater, with the average person owing $7,214 more than the car was actually worth. 40% of those buyers rolled the shortfall into an 84-month loan, 7 years, long enough to finance a vehicle, have a kid, and have that kid develop strong opinions about the vehicle. That number is the entire trap: those buyers never finish paying off the loan. They trade in early, still owing money, and roll the gap into the next one. You don't have a car payment, you have a car payment subscription, and it renews before you've finished paying for the last one. That's why the truck gets modeled here as a permanent monthly line rather than a 7-year one, because for 29% of buyers, that's exactly what it becomes. But the truck itself isn't the expensive part, it's what makes the expensive part necessary, because that payment has to come from somewhere. And it comes from the one line in Dalton's budget that doesn't send an angry letter when you skip it. That March, he stops contributing to his investments. Not forever, he tells himself, just for a while. The balance looks healthy. The market feels overpriced. And $772 a month has to come from somewhere. This is the part that gets people, so let's actually price out a 5-year pause. Say you're 32, with $100,000 already invested and $1,000 a month going in. You stop for 5 years, then resume. You saved $60,000 during that pause. At 7% real returns, that pause ends up costing you about $476,000 by retirement, a 7-to-1 exchange rate on your own money. The dollars you skip in your 30s have the most runway of any dollars you'll ever save, so when you pause at 32, you're not really deciding to save $60,000 less, you're deciding to work extra years at the end of your life, on a day when you felt great about money. And almost nobody ever corrects course, only about 16% of people who pause ever make catch-up contributions. That autumn, the market drops 11% in 3 weeks. And I want to hand you something genuinely counterintuitive, because you've heard this next statistic used to argue the exact opposite of what it actually proves. You know the one, $10,000 invested in the S&P 500 at the start of 2005 and left untouched through 2024 grows to about $71,750. Miss the 10 best days, and you end up with $32,871. Miss the 60 best days, and you're left with $4,700 less than you started with. You've seen that chart in basically every advisor's slide deck since roughly the invention of the slide deck, always used to argue for discipline and cleverness. But look at the timing underneath it, 7 of those 10 best days happened within 2 weeks of the 10 worst days. Ned Davis Research and Hartford Funds found that roughly 78% of the best days land during a bear market or in the first 2 months of a new bull market. The best days don't show up during calm stretches when you feel sharp, they show up in the middle of the wreckage, sitting right next to the worst days, practically holding hands. So the chart isn't actually telling you to be disciplined. It's telling you your timing is structurally impossible. There's no version of you that dodges the crash and still catches the rebound, because they're the same week. That statistic, the one that's supposed to make you feel like a sophisticated investor, is really proof that nobody is one, including, gently, the person presenting the slide. Picking individual stocks is no kinder. Researcher Hendrik Bessembinder studied close to 26,000 U.S. stocks and found that about 58% of them underperformed 1-month Treasury bills over their entire lifetimes. Just 86 companies produced half of all the wealth the U.S. stock market created over 90 years. 86. So when you pick a stock, you're reaching for one of those 86, and the median result you actually catch loses to a savings vehicle your grandmother would call boring. Morningstar found that the average dollar invested in U.S. funds earned 8.7% a year, while the funds themselves returned 9.9%. That gap is you. It's the tax on flinching. Carla doesn't watch any of this play out, she can't, because there's nothing sitting in her account to panic about, and the reassessment on her house had just gone up again anyway. Dalton and Farid grab lunch that November. Dalton mentions his guy, the plan, the whiteboard, the folder, and offers to make an introduction. Farid says he'll think about it, then doesn't, because the paperwork looks tedious and he'd have to track down his login, which he's already lost twice. That's the entire decision, no principle involved. Farid was mildly lazy on a random Tuesday, and it made him a millionaire. Year 3, the folder. Say Dalton signs on at 1% of assets under management, not a scam, not a crook, just the standard fee you'd get quoted anywhere. Take his $100,000, add $1,000 a month, run it 30 years. At 7%, he ends up with about $1,232,000. At 6% after the fee, he ends up with about $807,000. That 1% costs him roughly $425,000, taken one invisible slice at a time, by a fee that grows bigger every time he succeeds. Now you might be thinking, Yank, that's unfair, a good advisor earns their 1%. Sometimes, yes, and that Morningstar gap is the proof. You might genuinely need someone to talk you off the ledge during a bad March, and an advisor who stops you from panic selling even once can pay for years of fees. That's real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But look at what you're actually paying for, maybe 4 hours of coaching a year, priced as a percentage that compounds against you for 3 decades. A fee-only planner charging by the hour gives you the same conversation for about $2,000, same coffee, same whiteboard, same folder. The problem was never the advice. It's a pricing structure that takes 1/5 of your lifetime savings to deliver it. And Dalton never sees a bill, the fee comes out before the balance is even shown to him. So every statement he opens for 30 years shows a number that's already been reduced, and it always looks like growth, because it is growth, just less than it should be. If someone asked you to hand over $425,000 in cash, you'd think about it for a year. You'll never actually be asked to. And if you've crossed 6 figures and then made 2 or 3 of these same calls yourself, you didn't fail some kind of character test, you got marketed to at the exact moment you were most receptive, by people trained to notice the week your balance moved. Carla got her own version of this, a letter, pre-approved, offering to let her borrow against her house at a rate she called reasonable. She didn't take it. But she thought about it for 4 days, right after financing a transmission at 19%. That's how home equity actually gets tapped, not with a hard sell, with an envelope. That's part of why I built a community around this stuff, not to sell you anything, because most people at this stage don't actually need an advisor. They need someone to tell them what the pitch is going to sound like before it shows up. Links below if that's useful. Year 5. Farid finally does something, and it happens by accident. His employer's retirement portal has a submenu with a name like Additional Contribution Elections, and buried inside it is an after-tax option his plan happens to allow. He clicks it on a Thursday, during a meeting he isn't really paying attention to. That click routes money past the ordinary contribution limit into Roth space. Worth checking whether your own plan has this option. For 2026, your 401k deferral limit is $24,500, but your total limit, counting employer contributions and after-tax money, is $72,000. That gap is the mega backdoor Roth, the most underused feature available at exactly this stage of net worth. Alongside it, your IRA limit is $7,500, your HSA limit is $4,400 for individuals or $8,750 for families, and the HSA is the only triple tax-advantaged account in the entire tax code, which you're probably just using to pay for prescriptions. That distracted click is worth this much to Farid, $100,000 grown for 25 years at 7% gross inside tax-advantaged space comes out to about $542,000. The same money in a taxable account, dragged down by 2% a year in taxes, comes out to about $338,000. A $204,000 difference, decided entirely by which envelope the money went into. Year 30. Let's add all of this up properly, because I've watched 100 videos just stack numbers like these, and stacking them is the wrong move. Farid, $100,000 start, $1,000 a month, 7% real, 30 years, he lands at $2,032,000. Dalton, same starting point, same salary, nothing invested for 5 years during the pause, then $600 a month afterward instead of $1,000 because the truck ate $400 and kept eating it, and the whole thing growing at 6% instead of 7% because of the fee, he finishes at $1,046,000. The gap between them is $986,000. Look at those 3 costs individually, and the fee costs about $425,000, the pause costs about $410,000, and the truck costs about $419,000. Add those up and you get over $1.2 million, more than the actual gap, because they overlap. Money the pause already cost him can't also be lost to the fee a second time. The honest number is $986,000. But here's the split that actually matters, and it's what I promised you at the start. Of that $986,000, the advisor, the coffee, the whiteboard, the folder, accounts for about $280,000, roughly 28%. Everyone expects the villain to be the guy in the quarter zip. He's less than a third of it. The other $706,000 came from the truck and the pause it forced, which is to say, from the envelope, from a piece of paper that showed up unrequested in week 6 with the rate already printed on it, that only existed because a number Farid worked 10 years to build had crossed a line that made him eligible. That's the whole thesis. It was never really about the advisor. The advisor is just the part you can see. Carla ends up at $1,226,000 total, ahead of Dalton, well behind Farid. But look at the composition, because it tells her whole life story. $551,000 of that is the house, and $675,000 is money she can actually reach, 55% liquid, at 62 years old, after 30 years of doing the responsible thing. She wasn't wrong to buy the house. She was wrong to read one number when she actually owned two very different kinds of assets. And Farid didn't win because he was disciplined. The tidy version of this story is that the boring guy had superior willpower, and that's not actually what happened. He forgot his password. He skipped the introduction because the paperwork looked annoying. He clicked a submenu during a meeting he wasn't paying attention to. Farid won because his phone never rang. His money sat somewhere that generated no commission for anybody, so not one person in the financial services industry had a reason to buy him coffee. He wasn't stronger than Dalton, there was no folder with his name on it, because there was no margin in printing one. I'm not a financial advisor, and none of this is financial advice, it's math, Federal Reserve data, and a lot of time spent watching people get sold things at the exact moment they felt proudest of themselves. So here's the one thing to actually do tonight, and it takes about 4 minutes, figure out what percentage of your net worth you could spend in the next 72 hours without selling anything, borrowing against anything, or paying a penalty. Not what the tracker says, what you can actually reach. For a lot of people, that number comes back under 5%. And if that's you, you don't have $100,000. You have a scoreboard and a house. Because $100,000 isn't a finish line. It isn't graduation. And it's definitely not permission to stop paying attention. The number in your account didn't make you rich, it made you findable. Keep doing the boring thing. It was working. That's exactly why they called.